Today, inside of Westminster Abbey is a burial urn sitting high on a wall. But this isn't just any normal vessel containing the remains of a prominent noble. Many people believe that interred inside of this entombing sculpture are the remains of the young princes in the Tower, the two children of King Edward V and his brother, Richard the Duke of York. The young princes in the Tower mystery has for centuries puzzled historians and captivated millions, as their disappearance inside the Tower of London is often linked to the rise of their uncle King Richard III, the very man who was appointed to protect them. But instead, Richard is often said to have had the boys murdered and disgraced publicly so that he could take the throne for himself. But inside the tomb within Westminster Abbey are the bones of two children. But there was also a lot of shocking finds found within this vessel when it was opened in the early 20th century, but there are still many questions about these bones, and there are hopes that these remains will one day be subjected to DNA analysis to try to piece the princes in the Tower mystery together once and for all. But what is inside of this tomb? The princes in the Tower are mentioned, and Edward V, the King of England and rightful successor of King Edward IV, and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York. The pair were inside of the Tower of London, and they were awaiting the coronation of the King, Edward V, but they at the time went missing and disappeared. Richard III, their uncle, usurped the throne, and he spoke out against the two boys, his nephews, and claimed that their mother and father's marriage was illegitimate and that he was the rightful King of England. But for years this mystery had no leads. However, in 1674 a number of bones were discovered by builders who were doing work inside the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London. Under a staircase they found the remains of two young children, and it was considered a strange place for the burials of two children to be made. These then were linked to the princes in the Tower, and at the time the King of England, Charles II, ordered that these skeletons should be treated as if they were the boys. He made huge arrangements for the interring of these remains inside of Westminster Abbey. The remains, or the collections of bones, were not placed inside of coffins, but they were collected and were held before a white marble sarcophagus was crafted and made for them. This was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and this urn was made by Joshua Marshall, the King's master mason. All of this shows how King Charles II was certain that these were the remains of Edward V and Richard the Duke of York. The warrant for the creation of the urn, dated on the 18th of February 1675, said, "These are to signify His Majesty's pleasure that you provide a white marble coffin for the supposed bodies of ye two princes lately found in the Tower of London, and that you cause the same to be interred in Henry VII's Lady Chapel, in such convenient place as the death of Westminster shall appoint." The urn was very well decorated, and to begin with, it had two crowns and plumes on top, but these then disappeared. As was requested by the King, the burial urn was placed in the north aisle of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, close to the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch and queen. A Latin inscription was carved into the urn, and this translated into English says, "Here lie the relics of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, these brothers being confined in the Tower of London, and there, stifled with pillows, were privately and meanly buried, by the order of their perfidious uncle Richard the usurper, whose bones long inquired after and wished for, after 191 years in the rubbish of the stairs, those lately leading to the chapel of the White Tower, were on the 17th day of July 1674, by undoubted proofs discovered, being buried deep in place. Charles II, a most compassionate prince, pitying their severe fate, ordered these unhappy princes to be laid amongst the monuments of their predecessors, 1678, in the 30th year of his reign. By all accounts, King Charles II believed that these bones were the remains of the boys, and one, of course, was the King of England. There has even been controversy over these remains over the centuries, and Queen Elizabeth II, the recently deceased queen, actually refused DNA testing on the bones many times, and it's not necessarily known why. possibly she believed, that the bones were of the princes, then it may have weakened her claim to the throne, or maybe she just believed that the mystery of these boys was best left as it was, and that it would have been wrong to extract DNA from the remains of the boys, and that this would be too invasive. There is hope that King Charles III would be more willing to subject the remains to some more vigorous scientific analysis to hopefully bring some form of closure onto this. And it is known that he is certainly more likely to grant this request than his mother was. But the burial urn was actually opened in 1933. However, what was found was shocking, and it's also left a lot to be desired, especially due to the fact that the men who did this did not really do a proper thorough job. Despite the investigation being a 20th century one, it was rather poorly carried out. In 1933, the Dean of Westminster agreed to allow the urn to be opened and then inspected. This, he hoped, would bring an end to speculation. The examination was conducted by Lawrence E. Tanner, the keeper of the monuments, and also the record keeper of the library, William Wright, the president of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and they were helped by a dental surgeon, Dr. George Northcroft, who was a specialist in children's dentistry. It was hoped that this man would be able to help deal with any teeth inside of the urn. In front of an audience of invited people, the urn was opened, and inside of the vessel many things were found. Part of Westminster Abbey was the location for its investigation and not a scientific room. The examination came up with a number of different conclusions, and it was found the remains were of two boys aged around 12 and 10. The experts measured the parts and also came up with this, and this of course is around the correct ages for the two princes, the disappeared princes, inside the Tower of London. Many remains were discovered, including the cranial vault, which was said to have belonged to King Edward V. But one thing to consider is that the investigation did not specifically conclude that these bones and remains belonged to the missing princes. This was put together and as concluded based on the age of the bones, but the men who looked at the remains did not say this themselves. It was said that it will be noted that Professor Wright, for convenience, assumed that these bones were those of Edward and Richard. This was perhaps unfortunate, for it has led some people to suppose that we definitely identified the bones as those princes. No such claim was made, and I was in fact particularly careful in the paper, which we read before the Society of Antiquaries, to make no such identification, and to adopt a cautious and not proven attitude throughout. They reached the conclusion that these were the bones of two children, aged 10 and 12, and there was also some staining on the skull which experts believed was consistent with the bloodstains caused by force of suffocation, indicating that these two boys were inside the Tower of London and were suffocated. This was something which obviously would make sense. However, what is strange is that the investigations missed a number of key things that could have added more proof that these were the bones of the princes. One thing they missed was looking at the gender of the remains. As if they were belonged to a girl, then of course this would cast it into serious doubt. They also did not really date the bones, and they did not come up with a rough estimate as to how old these remains were. If they were too early for the 15th century, this would also cast them into doubt. Photographs were taken of some of the remains, and there was also some questions that the stain on the skull was not a blood stain at all, but, strangely, amongst some of the bones was also a collection of animal bones, meaning these had been thrown inside of the urn too, practically alluding to the fact that these children had been interred with litter. One of the men who carried out the investigation claimed that, as to what happened after their death, no one can say, but I imagine that when the place in the elm chest in which they were found, Edward lay at the bottom on his back with a slight tilt to the left, and that Richard lay above him, face to face, and that when the chest was discovered in the 17th century, the workman broke into it from above and near its middle. I am led to these conclusions from the fact that there was far more of Edward's skeleton present than that of Richard's, since presumably lying deeper, it was less disturbed. Ribs, no less than 6, have been found, and that of these 3 were on the left side and belonged to Edward, and 3 on the right side belonged to Richard, and that similarly 1 of the left clavicle of Edward and the right clavicle of Richard were present, strongly suggesting that the left shoulder of Edward had been in close contact with the right shoulder of Richard's. Need I go on? He described the state of the remains and said that on the examination commencing, it soon became apparent that the bones were those of 2 children of about the right age for the princes. Parts of 2 skulls, 2 jawbones, 2 thigh bones were seen to be there, and the thigh bones, when placed side by side, demonstrated that one was longer than the other. This was the first and last time the burial urn containing allegedly the 2 princes in the tower has been opened, and still today there are a number of questions around this. There are also, it's claimed, 2 unmarked children's coffins found in or near to the tomb of King Edward IV inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor. This could also be the boys. There are too many questions that still exist around the disappearance of Edward V and Richard the Duke of York, and there is still much evidence being hunted for regarding what happened to them. But do you think their remains are inside of the urn within Westminster Abbey? Thank you for watching and support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.